In a quiet and remote town nestled in the rugged heart of Colorado, surrounded by rocky hills and sprawling golden plains, there lived a humble and reserved couple. Among the townsfolk, they were known simply as William and Claire. Claire, a radiant blonde with a warm and kind demeanor, was heavily pregnant, her glowing presence a sharp contrast to the harsh and unforgiving landscape. William, her husband, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold secrets few dared to uncover. The town itself was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and news traveled faster than the wind sweeping through the valley. While the locals respected the couple, they knew little about William's past. He worked as a skilled blacksmith, quietly fixing horseshoes and crafting tools, but there was a certain air about him, a quiet intensity that made people tread carefully. Rumors floated about his younger days, but no one dared to ask. It was a particularly scorching afternoon when the peace of the town was disrupted. Claire had ventured into the town square, her delicate hands clutching a small wicker basket filled with groceries. She moved with care, her condition evident to anyone who looked her way. As she stopped to rest on a bench, 3 rough-looking men approached her. These were outsiders, strangers with no regard for the town's unspoken rules of respect and decency. The leader of the group, a wiry man with a sneer that stretched across his face, leaned in close. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Ain't you a sight for sore eyes? A little birdie like you shouldn't be out alone." Claire's hand instinctively went to her belly, her heart pounding as she tried to mask her fear. "Please, I'm just here to get supplies," she said softly, her voice trembling but polite. The men laughed, their crude jokes echoing through the square. "Supplies, huh?" Another one snickered. "You think your little husband's going to protect you? Where is he, anyway?" Unbeknownst to the men, William was closer than they thought. From the shadows of his workshop, he watched the scene unfold, his jaw tightening and his eyes narrowing. He wasn't just a husband or a blacksmith. He was a man who had faced dangers far greater than these fools could imagine, and they were about to learn that the hard way. The 3 men continued to mock Claire, their taunts growing louder as the townsfolk watched from a distance, too afraid to intervene. The wiry leader leaned even closer, his grimy hand gesturing toward Claire's basket. "What have you got in there?" "Something for us," he sneered, his companions laughing in unison. Claire held her ground, though her hands trembled. "Please, just leave me alone," she said firmly, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her unease. She took a step back, her heart racing, but she refused to show them weakness. Deep down, she clung to the belief that William would soon step in. From across the square, William observed silently, his mind already calculating. He hadn't intervened yet because he wanted to understand these men, to see how far they were willing to push. His past had taught him the value of patience, but his protective instincts were roaring. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. The leader smirked, clearly enjoying Claire's discomfort. "Oh, come on, sweetheart, don't be like that. We're just trying to have some fun. You should smile more. It suits a pretty thing like you." He reached for her arm, but before his fingers could graze her sleeve, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The 3 men turned abruptly, their laughter silenced. Standing a few paces away was William, his arms crossed and his gaze icy. His tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, a warning. The leader sized him up, unimpressed. "And who might you be?" "Her knight in shining armor." William's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, though his eyes remained cold. "Something like that." The leader chuckled, trying to mask his unease. "Listen, old man, we don't want any trouble. We're just talking to the lady here." William stepped closer, his presence looming. "Funny, from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like she's enjoying the conversation." The tension in the air was palpable. The other townsfolk, sensing that something significant was about to unfold, kept their distance but couldn't look away. Claire took the opportunity to retreat to William's side, clutching his arm tightly. "William, don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not worth it." But William wasn't one to back down, not when his family was threatened. He glanced at Claire, his expression softening for just a moment. "Go home, Claire," he said gently but firmly. "I'll handle this." Reluctantly, she nodded, knowing better than to argue. As she walked away, the leader of the group called after her, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, We're scared now. The big, bad husband's here to save the day." William's jaw tightened. He turned back to the men, his stance calm but deliberate. "You've got two choices," he said, his voice steady. "You can leave this town right now and never come back, or you can stay, and we'll settle this my way." The leader scoffed, stepping forward. "And what's your way, huh? You gonna bore us to death with your blacksmith stories?" The other two men laughed, but their amusement faltered as William's expression darkened. He didn't reply, instead letting the silence speak for itself. The leader's smirk faltered ever so slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. One of the men, a burly brute with a scar across his cheek, muttered under his breath, "Maybe we should just leave Pete. He doesn't look like he's bluffing." But Pete, stubborn and prideful, refused to back down. "Shut it, Frank. This guy's just trying to act tough." William's voice cut through their argument. "Last chance." Pete hesitated, his bravado faltering under William's piercing gaze. There was something unnerving about this man, something that made him feel as though he'd just stepped into a trap, but his ego wouldn't let him walk away. "Fine," Pete snarled. "You want to play tough guy? Let's see what you've got." William's eyes narrowed, and a ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "Your mistake." With a swift, calculated motion, William grabbed a nearby hammer from his workbench. He didn't raise it threateningly. He didn't need to. The mere sight of the tool in his capable hands was enough to send a clear message. He wasn't just a blacksmith. He was a man who knew how to wield his tools with deadly precision. Pete's confidence crumbled as the realization hit him. The townsfolk began to murmur, their curiosity turning to awe as they watched the confrontation unfold. Frank and the third man exchanged nervous glances, their bravado evaporating. William took a single step forward, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Leave." "Now," Pete faltered, his sneer replaced by a look of uncertainty. For a moment, it seemed he might try to stand his ground, but the intensity in William's eyes was too much. He muttered a curse under his breath and gestured for his companions to follow. As they slinked away, William watched them go, his stance unwavering. Only when they disappeared from sight did he relax, placing the hammer back on the workbench. The townsfolk erupted into whispers, their admiration for William growing tenfold, but William paid them no mind. He turned and headed home. Knowing this wasn't over, not yet. The bandits may have left the square humiliated, but their bruised egos burned hotter than the Colorado sun. Pete, the wiry leader, led his companions to a secluded clearing just outside of town, where they set up a makeshift camp among the thick pines. He paced back and forth, his fists clenched, muttering curses under his breath. "Child, did you see the way that guy looked at me?" Pete spat, kicking at a nearby rock, "like I was nothing. Nobody disrespects me like that and gets away with it." Frank, the burly man with the scar, leaned against a tree, his expression wary. "Maybe we should let it go, Pete. That guy, he's not normal. Did you see the way he carried himself, like he's done this before?" "Done what before?" Pete snapped, turning on him. "He's just a blacksmith. He's probably never even held a gun. We're the ones with the firepower here, Frank. Don't tell me you're scared of some hick with a hammer." Frank shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. The third man, a lanky fellow named Tommy, spoke up, trying to diffuse the tension. "Look, Pete, maybe we just leave this town alone. There's plenty of other places we can hit. No need to stir up trouble." Pete rounded on Tommy, his face contorted with anger. "Are you two cowards? That man humiliated us in front of the whole town. You think anyone's going to take us seriously after this? We need to show them who's in charge." Frank and Tommy exchanged uneasy glances, but knew better than to argue further. Pete was their leader, and his pride wouldn't let this slight go unanswered. Meanwhile, back in town, Claire sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she sipped a cup of tea. The encounter in the square had left her shaken, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the bandits weren't done with them. She glanced at William, who stood by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "They'll come back, won't they?" she asked softly. William didn't look away from the window. "Probably." Claire's stomach churned with anxiety. "William, what are we going to do? I don't want any trouble, especially not now with the baby on the way." William turned to her, his expression softening. "You don't need to worry about them, Claire. I won't let anything happen to you or the baby. I promise." Though his words were reassuring, Claire couldn't help but notice the way his hand rested on the rifle, leaning against the wall. She had always known there was more to William than he let on, but he rarely spoke about his past. All she knew was that he had been in the military once, long before they met, and that he carried the weight of those days in the quiet strength he exuded. As night fell, William prepared for the inevitable. He checked the locks on the doors and windows, then gathered supplies, a first aid kit, extra ammunition, and a hunting knife. Claire watched him in silence, her unease growing with every passing moment. "William," she said finally, her voice trembling, "what if they're more dangerous than we think?" He paused, his back to her, before turning with a calm but resolute expression. "They're dangerous, but I've faced worse. And they've already made their biggest mistake." "What mistake?" Claire asked, her brow furrowed. "They threatened my family," William said simply, his voice carrying a quiet fury that sent a chill down her spine. At their camp, Pete was rallying his men for a nighttime attack. He sketched a crude map of the town in the dirt, marking the location of William and Claire's house. "We'll hit him where it hurts," Pete said with a twisted grin. "Make him regret ever messing with us." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Pete, are you sure about this? The guy didn't even do anything to us. He just stood up for his wife." Pete's glare silenced him. "You think this is about him standing up for his wife? This is about respect. If we let this slide, people will think they can walk all over us. We're setting an example." Tommy, still uneasy but loyal to a fault, nodded. "Fine. But what if he fights back?" Pete smirked. "Then we'll show him what happens to heroes." As the bandits made their way toward the edge of town, their laughter echoed through the trees. They were confident, cocky, and oblivious to the fact that William was already one step ahead. From his perch on the second floor of the house, William watched the flicker of torches moving through the darkness. He adjusted the rifle in his hands, his movements steady and deliberate. He had fortified the house earlier in the evening, setting up barricades and tripwires that would alert him to any intruders. "They're here," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of grim determination. Claire's breath hitched. "What do we do?" William glanced at her, his expression unwavering. "Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone but me. If anything happens, you know where the shotgun is." Claire nodded, her hands clutching her belly as she prayed silently. William kissed her forehead and turned toward the stairs, his mind already focused on the task ahead. He wasn't just defending his home, he was defending his family, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The night was eerily silent, save for the distant sound of footsteps crunching through the dirt as Pete and his crew approached the house. Their torches flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows across the barren ground. Pete, who at the front of the group, carried an air of arrogant confidence, oblivious to the danger lying in wait. "This is gonna be easy," Pete muttered, his smirk stretching wider. "Bet he's inside, shaking in his boots." Frank and Tommy followed closely, their expressions betraying nervousness. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house stood there, dark and quiet, as if daring them to come closer. "Pete," Frank whispered, "are you sure about this? What if he's ready for us?" Pete waved him off. "Stop whining. He's probably asleep, thinking we wouldn't have the guts to show up." As they neared the front porch, Tommy suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Wait," he hissed, pointing to the ground. "What's that?" Pete crouched down, squinting at the faint glint of wire stretched across the ground near the steps. "A tripwire," he muttered, his voice low. "It looks like the blacksmith's got some tricks up his sleeve." Frank's unease grew. "See, I told you this guy isn't normal. He's prepared for us." Pete stood, brushing dirt off his hands. "Doesn't matter. He can't stop all three of us. Spread out. Frank, take the back. Tommy, stay here and keep watch." Frank hesitated but did as he was told, circling around to the back of the house. Tommy, left alone on the porch, shifted nervously, his fingers twitching near the pistol on his belt. Pete, meanwhile, carefully stepped over the tripwire, his eyes scanning the windows for any sign of movement. Inside, William watched their approach from the shadows of the second floor. His sharp eyes tracked each man's movements, noting their positions. He had no intention of letting them get far. Quietly, he adjusted his rifle and took aim at the porch. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence of the night. The bullet struck the ground mere inches from Tommy's feet, sending him stumbling backward with a yelp. "He's shooting at us!" Tommy shouted, scrambling for cover. Pete cursed under his breath. "Stay down, he's just trying to scare us." But William wasn't aiming to scare. He wanted to make it clear that he wasn't afraid to defend his home. His second shot hit the lantern in Pete's hand, plunging the area into darkness. The sudden loss of light sent the bandits into chaos. Frank, hearing the commotion from the back of the house, froze. He glanced around nervously, the shadows playing tricks on his mind. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of the wind felt like a threat. He didn't see the tripwire near the back door until it was too late. His foot caught on the wire, triggering a small explosion of noise as a makeshift alarm went off, a tin can rigged to crash against the door. The sound echoed through the night, alerting William to Frank's location. William shifted his focus, moving silently through the house like a predator stalking its prey. He had spent years honing his skills in the military, and this situation was all too familiar. These men were amateurs, and their disorganization played right into his hands. Outside, Pete was growing increasingly agitated. "Frank, what's going on back there?" Frank's voice came through, shaky and uncertain. "There's traps everywhere." "This guy's insane." Tommy, still cowering near the porch, muttered, "We need to get out of here, Pete. This isn't worth it." Pete rounded on him, his face twisted with fury. "No, we finish this. We—" His words were cut off by the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. Pete turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he found himself staring down the barrel of William's weapon. William had stepped out onto the porch, his calm demeanor unnerving in its intensity. "This is your last chance," William said, his voice low and steady. "Leave now, and you might make it out of here alive." Pete's hand twitched toward his pistol, but William shook his head. "Don't even think about it." Frank, emerging from the shadows at the back of the house, saw the scene unfolding and froze. Tommy, still crouched near the steps, dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Okay, we're leaving." Pete hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. But as William took a step closer, his shotgun unwavering, Pete finally relented. "Fine," he spat. "We're leaving." William lowered the shotgun slightly but didn't take his eyes off them. "Good, and if I ever see you near my family again, you won't get another warning." The bandits slowly backed away, their earlier bravado shattered. As they disappeared into the night, William stood on the porch watching until they were out of sight. Only then did he lower his weapon, his tense shoulders relaxing slightly. Inside, Claire waited anxiously, her hands clenched tightly. When William finally stepped back into the house, she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," he replied, holding her close. "But I don't think we've seen the last of them." The bandits retreated to their campsite in the forest, their pride bruised and their confidence shaken. Pete was furious. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. He kicked a log near the fire, sending embers flying into the dark night. "This isn't over," he growled, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "That blacksmith thinks he's smarter than us. We'll show him who's really in charge." Tommy, still visibly shaken, sat on a fallen tree, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. "Pete, maybe we should just let this go. That guy isn't normal. He was prepared for us, and he's not afraid to pull the trigger." Pete whirled on him, his face a mask of rage. "Let it go. Let it go. Do you have any idea what people will say about us if we back down now? We'll be a laughingstock." "No, Tommy, we're going back. And this time we're going to do it right." Frank, leaning against a nearby tree, crossed his arms and sighed. "Pete, listen to yourself. This isn't about respect anymore. It's about your ego. You're going to get us killed." Pete's eyes burned with fury as he stepped closer to Frank, his finger jabbing at his chest. "If you're too scared to fight, then maybe you shouldn't be here at all. Go on, run back to your mama." Frank didn't flinch, his scarred face set in a hard line. "I'm not scared of Pete, I'm just not stupid. That man has nothing to lose when it comes to protecting his family. You saw how calm he was back there. He's done this before." Pete sneered but didn't respond. Deep down, he knew Frank was right. There was something unsettling about the blacksmith, something that hinted at a violent past. But Pete's pride wouldn't let him back down. He couldn't afford to look weak. Not in front of his crew, not in front of himself. "Fine," Pete said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you're so sure he's dangerous, then we'll even the odds. We'll bring more firepower, more men. Let's see how tough he is when it's 3 against 10. Tommy's head snapped up, his eyes widening in alarm. "You're bringing more men. Pete, this is crazy. We're not soldiers, we're thieves. We're not equipped for this." Pete smirked, his confidence returning. "Relax, Tommy. We're not going in blind this time. We'll hit him when he least expects it. He can't stay awake forever." At the house, William sat at the kitchen table, meticulously cleaning his rifle. The tension in the air was palpable, though he tried to keep his expression neutral for Claire's sake. She sat across from him, her hands cradling a warm cup of tea, though she hadn't taken a sip. "They're going to come back," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. "I know," William replied, his tone calm but resolute. Claire set the cup down, her hands trembling. "And what if this time they don't stop? What if they—" William reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "They won't win," he said firmly. "I won't let them!" Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared, William." "I know," he said softly, his grip on her hands tightening. "But I've faced worse than this, Claire. You have to trust me." She nodded, though the fear in her heart didn't dissipate. She had always known William was a strong man, but tonight she saw something deeper, a quiet ferocity that both reassured and terrified her. Whatever these bandits had stirred, it wasn't just a protective instinct. It was something primal, something that had been dormant for years. By dawn, Pete had rallied a group of 7 more men, ruffians and drifters who didn't care much for the details of the job as long as there was the promise of loot. They gathered at the edge of the forest, armed with rifles, knives, and an unsettling eagerness for violence. Pete stood before them, outlining the plan with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "We'll surround the house," he said, his voice carrying authority. "Hit them from all sides. He can't defend every angle. We go in hard and fast, take what we want, and teach him a lesson he'll never forget." Frank stood near the back of the group, his expression unreadable. He had tried to convince Pete to abandon the plan, but his words had fallen on deaf ears. Now he could only hope this wouldn't end in disaster. As the group made their way toward the house, the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was heavy with anticipation, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. But as they approached the clearing, something stopped them in their tracks. The house stood silent and imposing, its windows dark and its porch empty. It was as if the place was holding its breath, waiting. Pete gestured for the men to spread out, his confidence unwavering. "Stay sharp," he muttered, his eyes scanning the area. "He's here somewhere." What Pete didn't know was that William had anticipated their return. He had spent the night fortifying the house further, setting traps and preparing for an ambush. From his hidden vantage point, he watched the group move closer, his mind calculating every move. This wasn't just a fight to defend his home, it was a battle to end this once and for all. As the bandits crept closer to the house, the air grew thick with tension. Pete led the group, his every step calculated but dripping with arrogance. The others followed cautiously, their weapons drawn, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The house loomed ahead, silent and foreboding, almost as if it were daring them to come closer. Inside, William was ready. From his hidden vantage point on the second floor, he watched the bandits approach, his sharp eyes taking note of their numbers and positioning. He had anticipated Pete would bring reinforcements, and he had adjusted his strategy accordingly. This wasn't just a defense, it was a trap. As Pete motioned for his men to fan out around the property, one of them, a lanky man with a nervous twitch, stepped on a concealed pressure plate hidden beneath the dirt. The ground gave a faint click before a loud bang shattered the silence. A homemade flash trap erupted, sending a blinding light and a deafening noise across the clearing. The man stumbled backward, clutching his ears, while the others ducked in alarm. "What the hell was that?" one of the bandits shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Pete snarled, grabbing the man by the collar. "It's a trap, idiot. He's trying to scare us. Stay focused." But the damage was already done. The bandits were rattled, their confidence shaken as they realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary blacksmith. Pete, determined to maintain control, barked orders to regroup. "Stick together. We'll flush him out." William, crouched behind the window with his rifle, smirked. The flash trap had done its job. It had disrupted their formation and put them on edge. Now it was time to escalate. He aimed carefully, his finger steady on the trigger, and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the ground inches from Pete's feet, sending up a cloud of dust. Pete jumped back, his bravado faltering for a split second. "You see that?" Pete shouted, his voice rising. "He's playing games with us." From the shadows, William's voice rang out, calm and cutting. "Leave now and this ends here. Push further, and you won't make it out alive." The bandits froze, exchanging uneasy glances. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, amplified by the eerie silence of the clearing. Frank, standing at the back of the group, spoke up. "Pete, maybe we should listen to him. This guy isn't messing around." Pete turned on him, his face twisted with rage. "You think I'm scared of some backwoods blacksmith? He's just one man and we've got 10. Stop acting like a coward." But even Pete couldn't deny the unease creeping into his mind. William's calm, measured tone carried the weight of experience, the kind that came from years of facing life-and-death situations. This wasn't a man bluffing to protect his family. This was a man who had seen war. From inside the house, Claire clutched the shotgun William had given her, her knuckles white as she sat in the corner of the bedroom. She could hear the commotion outside, the sharp crack of William's rifle and the muffled shouts of the bandits. Her heart raced as she prayed silently for his safety. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps on the porch made her freeze. Someone was trying to enter the house. The doorknob rattled, followed by the sound of heavy boots kicking at the door. Claire's breath hitched as she raised the shotgun, her hands trembling. "Come on, open up," a voice growled from the other side. "We know you're in there." The door didn't budge, thanks to the reinforced barricades William had installed earlier. But the pounding continued, each thud sending a jolt of fear through Claire. She steadied her hands, remembering William's words. "If anything happens, you know what to do." Outside, William continued to pick off the bandits one by one. He didn't aim to kill, not yet. Each shot was calculated to disable, to instill fear. A bullet grazed a man's leg, sending him sprawling to the ground, clutching his wound. Another shattered the lantern in one of their hands, plunging the area into deeper darkness. Pete's frustration boiled over. "Spread out!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Find him and take him down!" But the group's cohesion was gone. The bandits moved erratically, their fear overpowering their judgment. William used the chaos to his advantage, moving silently from window to window, always staying one step ahead. Frank, crouched behind a tree, called out to Pete. "This isn't working. We're sitting ducks out here." "Shut up and do your job," Pete barked, but his own fear was evident. He wiped sweat from his brow, his mind racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had expected an easy fight, not a calculated ambush. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the bandits found themselves cornered. Every step they took seemed to trigger another trap. Hidden spikes, tripwires, and strategically placed barriers slowed their advance. And all the while, William's rifle rang out like a hunter picking off prey. Finally, Pete's bravado cracked. "Fall back," he shouted, waving his men toward the trees. "We'll regroup and—" He didn't finish his sentence. A single shot rang out, and the rifle in his hand shattered, splinters flying in every direction. Pete stumbled back, his face pale as he stared at the remnants of his weapon. From the shadows, William emerged, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his eyes cold as steel. "You're done," he said, his voice steady. "Leave now and don't ever come back." The bandits didn't wait for Pete's command. One by one, they dropped their weapons and fled into the forest, their earlier confidence reduced to ashes. Pete hesitated, his fists clenched, but the look in William's eyes left no room for negotiation. He turned and followed his men, disappearing into the trees without another word. William stood there for a long moment, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the clearing. He had won, but he knew this wasn't the end. As the bandits disappeared into the trees, William lowered his rifle, his eyes still scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The early morning sun bathed the clearing in a warm glow, but the tension in the air remained heavy. He exhaled deeply, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. This wasn't over, not completely. Men like Pete didn't just walk away without plotting revenge. Inside the house, Claire waited in agonizing silence. She had heard the gunshots and the muffled shouts, each one tightening the knot of fear in her chest. When the sound of footsteps on the porch reached her ears, she gripped the shotgun tighter, her heart pounding. "Claire," William's voice called softly. "It's me." She let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her as she lowered the shotgun. A moment later, William stepped inside, his face calm, but his body radiating a tension she could feel across the room. "Are you okay?" he asked, crossing the room to her. Claire nodded, though her hands still trembled. "I was so scared, William, I thought—" He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I told you I wouldn't let anything happen to you," he said softly, his voice steady. "They're gone now." For a while they stood there in silence, the weight of the night hanging over them, but Claire couldn't shake the unease that lingered in her heart. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William stepped back, his hands resting on her shoulders as he looked into her eyes. "They might," he admitted, "but if they do, they won't catch me off guard. I'll be ready." Claire nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety. She knew William was strong, capable, and determined to protect them, but she also knew he was only one man and the bandits were ruthless. In the forest, the defeated bandits regrouped at their campsite. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing faintly in the early morning light. Pete sat on a log, his face pale and drawn. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, the usual confidence in his demeanor replaced by a simmering rage. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Frank, sitting across from him, shook his head. "It should be, Pete. We've lost. That guy's not just some blacksmith. He's a trained killer. We're lucky we got out of there alive." Pete's eyes narrowed, his anger flaring. "Lucky? Do you hear yourself? He humiliated us in front of the whole town. You think I'm just going to let that slide?" Tommy, seated nearby, chimed in hesitantly. "Pete, maybe Frank's right. That guy was ready for us. If we go back, we'll just end up—" "Enough!" Pete roared, his voice echoing through the trees. He stood abruptly, his cigarette falling to the ground. "I don't care what you two think. I'm not backing down. We'll find a way to take him out, one way or another." Frank and Tommy exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue further. They knew Pete wouldn't listen. His pride was too wounded, his desire for revenge too consuming. Back at the house, William began fortifying their home even further. He reinforced the doors and windows, set up additional traps around the perimeter, and created a secure space in the basement where Claire could hide if things escalated. Every move he made was calculated, his mind working like a machine as he prepared for the inevitable. Claire watched him from the doorway, her heart heavy with worry. She had never seen this side of him before, the meticulous, tactical thinker who moved with purpose and precision. It was a stark reminder of the life he had lived before they met, a life he rarely spoke about. "William," she said softly, stepping into the room, "what happened to you? Before you came here, I mean." He paused, his hands stilling as he adjusted a barricade. For a moment he didn't answer, his eyes focused on the task in front of him. Then he sighed, turning to face her. "I was a soldier," he said simply. "A long time ago." Claire nodded, sensing there was more to the story, but knowing better than to press him. "And now?" "Now I'm a husband," he replied, his gaze steady. "And soon I'll be a father. That's all that matters." Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice firm despite the fear that lingered in her heart. "Together." William nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Together." As night fell once again, William stood watch by the window, his rifle within arm's reach. The town was quiet, the events of the previous night leaving an uneasy calm in the air. But William knew better than to trust the silence. He had seen too much, lived through too many battles, to let his guard down. From his vantage point, he spotted a flicker of movement at the edge of the forest. His grip on the rifle tightened as he watched the shadows shift. It was only a matter of time before Pete made his next move. But this time, William wouldn't just defend his home, he would end this once and for all. The second night began with a chilling quiet. The wind whispered through the trees, and the moon cast long shadows across the clearing. William sat near the window, his rifle resting against the wall, his sharp eyes scanning the edge of the forest. He could feel it in his bones. They were coming. This wasn't just a defense anymore. It was a standoff, and he was ready to finish what they had started. Inside the house, Claire sat in the basement, a lantern flickering softly as she cradled her belly. She had reluctantly agreed to stay hidden, knowing that William's insistence wasn't just for her safety, it was for their unborn child. She whispered a silent prayer, her fingers trembling as she clutched the small cross around her neck. Outside, Pete and his group approached with a dangerous resolve. They had brought reinforcements, 3 more men from a nearby town who were notorious for their violent tendencies. Pete's confidence had returned, fueled by the numbers at his side and the arsenal of weapons they carried. This time, "We're not leaving until that blacksmith's house is nothing but ashes," Pete growled, his voice low but seething with rage. "Spread out, but stay coordinated." "He's smart, but we're smarter." Frank hesitated, glancing toward the house. The darkness surrounding it felt unnatural, like the house itself was alive and waiting for them. "Pete, we should think this through. He's ready for us." What if nothing?" Pete snapped, cutting him off. "Do your job, or get out of my sight." Frank sighed but followed orders, his unease growing with every step. The group moved in carefully, their boots crunching softly against the dirt. They had learned from their previous mistakes, avoiding the tripwires and traps that had thwarted them the night before. Pete, leading the charge, signaled for the group to surround the house. As they closed in, the silence was broken by a faint creak. Pete froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his pistol. The sound came again, this time louder, a deliberate creak, like a door slowly opening. He turned toward the source, his eyes narrowing. William stepped out onto the porch, his silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of the lantern inside the house. He stood tall, his rifle resting casually in his hands, his expression calm but deadly. "I told you not to come back," he said, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. Pete smirked, though the tension in his posture betrayed his bravado. "You think you can scare us, old man? We've got you outnumbered." William tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched." Pete's grin faltered as William raised his rifle with practiced ease. Before Pete could react, William fired a warning shot that struck the ground inches from his feet. The group scattered, their confidence shaken as they scrambled for cover. "Stay together!" Pete barked, his voice cracking with frustration. "He can't take us all at once." But William wasn't playing their game. He moved swiftly and silently, using the shadows to his advantage. He fired another shot, this time hitting the lantern one of the men carried. The glass shattered, plunging the area into near-total darkness. The reinforcements Pete had brought began to falter, their earlier bravado dissolving into panic. "What the hell is this guy?" one of them muttered, his voice trembling. Frank, crouched behind a tree, tried to steady his breathing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. "Pete, we need to call this off or we're not winning this." "Shut up!" Pete hissed, his own fear creeping into his voice. He's just one man. But the longer the fight dragged on, the more it became clear that William was no ordinary man. He anticipated their every move, using their fear and disorganization against them. One by one, the bandits were picked off, not killed, but incapacitated. A shot to the leg here, a shattered weapon there. Each strike was precise, calculated, and designed to send a message. You don't belong here. Finally, only Pete and 2 others remained, their breaths ragged as they huddled behind the wreckage of an old wagon. Pete's hands shook as he loaded his pistol, his mind racing. "We can still do this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The others didn't respond. Their fear was palpable, their courage drained. They glanced at each other, silently weighing their options. From the shadows, William's voice rang out again, calm and unyielding. "It's over, Pete. Walk away while you still can." Pete's grip on his pistol tightened. He couldn't walk away, not after everything. His pride wouldn't let him. "Not a chance," he spat, stepping out from behind the wagon. He raised his pistol, aiming blindly into the darkness, but before he could fire, a sharp, searing pain shot through his hand. The pistol clattered to the ground as he cried out, clutching his wounded hand. William emerged from the shadows, his rifle still trained on Pete. "I warned you," William said, his voice low and steady. "This is your last chance." Pete fell to his knees, his earlier arrogance replaced by a desperate fear. Okay, he shouted, his voice trembling. "We'll leave. Just don't shoot." William held his gaze for a long moment before lowering his rifle. "Go," he said, "and don't come back." The remaining men didn't wait for Pete's command. They scrambled to their feet and ran into the forest, leaving their leader behind. Pete, clutching his injured hand, staggered to his feet and followed them, disappearing into the darkness. William stood still, his eyes fixed on the trees until the last of them was gone. The night fell silent once more, the only sound the soft rustle of the wind. The dawn arrived quietly, casting a soft golden light over the small house and the surrounding clearing. The battle was over, and the silence was a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. William stood on the porch, his rifle still in hand, his eyes scanning the forest's edge. The bandits were gone, for now, but he knew better than to assume it was truly over. Inside the house, Claire emerged cautiously from the basement, her heart still racing despite the calm morning air. She found William standing rigid, his posture tense, the weight of the night still visible in the set of his shoulders. "William," she called softly, stepping onto the porch. He turned, and his expression softening as he saw her. "It's okay," he said, his voice low but reassuring. "They're gone." Claire moved closer, placing a hand on his arm. "For good?" William hesitated. "I hope so," he admitted. "But men like Pete don't let go of grudges easily." Her grip on his arm tightened. "Then what do? We can't live like this, always looking over our shoulders." William looked out at the horizon, his jaw tightening. "We prepare," he said simply. "We stay ready for whatever comes next." Claire nodded, though the words did little to ease the worry in her heart. She knew William would do anything to protect her and their unborn child, but she also knew the toll it was taking on him. The man she loved was strong, but even he wasn't invincible. Deep in the forest, Pete and the remnants of his crew regrouped at a different campsite, their confidence shattered and their morale at an all-time low. Pete sat by the fire, his injured hand wrapped in a makeshift bandage, his expression dark and brooding. His men sat silently, avoiding his gaze, the memory of their humiliating defeat fresh in their minds. "This isn't over," Pete muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was filled with venom, but it lacked the usual conviction. "That blacksmith thinks he's won, but I'll show him. I'll show all of them." Frank, leaning against a tree, crossed his arms. "Face it, Pete. We're beaten. That guy played us like fools." Pete glared at him. "You think I'm just going to walk away? After what he did to us?" "What he did," Frank shot back, his voice rising, "was defend his family, and he did it better than we could have ever prepared for. You don't even know who we're dealing with, Pete. He's not just some blacksmith." Pete's face twisted with anger, but deep down he couldn't deny the truth of Frank's words. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down. "You're scared," he spat. "All of you, but not me. I'll handle this myself if I have to." Frank shook his head and stood, his patience wearing thin. "You're on your own, Pete." "I'm done." One by one, the other men rose and followed Frank, leaving Pete alone by the fire. He watched them go, his hands trembling with a mix of rage and fear. He was determined to have the last word, but for the first time, he felt the weight of his isolation. Back at the house, William focused on restoring a sense of normalcy. He patched up the damage to the property, reset the traps around the perimeter, and ensured that the house was as secure as possible. Claire helped where she could, her resolve growing stronger with every passing hour. They had survived 2 nights of terror, and she refused to let fear dictate their lives. As the day wore on, a visitor arrived, a man from the town who had heard about the events of the past 2 nights. His name was Sheriff Daniels, a tall, grizzled man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He rode up on horseback, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "William," the sheriff greeted, his tone cautious, "heard you had some trouble." William met him at the gate, his stance relaxed but his guard up. "Something like that," he replied. The sheriff glanced at the reinforced house and the faint scorch marks on the ground. "Seems like more than just trouble. You handled it." "For now," William said, his tone even. The sheriff studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Folks in town are talking. Some are scared. Others are impressed. Either way, they're looking to you." William frowned. "I didn't do this for attention. I did it to protect my family." "I know," the sheriff said, "but word spreads. And if those men come back, you won't be alone. The town's ready to stand with you." William considered this, his mind working through the implications. He had always preferred to keep to himself, but now his actions had drawn the community closer. Perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. "Thank you," William said finally. "I appreciate it." The sheriff tipped his hat again. "Just doing my job. You take care of that family of yours, William, and if you need anything, you know where to find me." As the sheriff rode off, William returned to the porch, where Claire waited. She looked at him with a mix of relief and determination. "Are we really safe now?" she asked. William reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We will be," he said, "because I'm not letting anyone take this away from us." The following days passed in an uneasy calm. The townsfolk went about their lives, but whispers of what had happened spread quickly. People spoke in hushed tones about William's bravery, his mysterious past, and how he had single-handedly driven off a gang of dangerous men. Some admired him. Others feared what such a man might be capable of. For William and Claire, life seemed to settle into a fragile normalcy. William continued to fortify their home, though he tried not to let Claire see the extent of his preparations. He wanted her to feel safe, even if he couldn't shake the feeling that Pete wasn't done. One afternoon, as William repaired the wooden fence near the edge of their property, a young boy from the town approached on horseback. The boy, no older than 14, dismounted and handed William a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" William asked, eyeing the boy carefully. "It's from the sheriff," the boy replied. "He said it's urgent." William unfolded the note and read it quickly. Sheriff Daniels had received word from a nearby town that Pete was trying to rally more men. The message was clear. Pete hadn't given up and he was planning something big. William folded the note and nodded to the boy. "Thank you. Tell the sheriff I got it." The boy hesitated, looking up at William with wide eyes. "Are you going to stop him?" William placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "Don't worry about that. Just get back to town safely." As the boy rode off, William's expression darkened. He knew Pete wouldn't stop until he either succeeded or was stopped for good. The time for waiting was over. That evening, William sat with Claire at the kitchen table, the note from the sheriff lying between them. Claire read it, her face pale as she set it down. "So he's coming back," she said quietly. It wasn't a question, it was a realization. William nodded. "It looks like it." Claire's hands trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. "What are we going to do?" "I'm going to end this," William said firmly. "I can't let him keep threatening us, or the town." Claire's eyes filled with worry. "You can't do this alone, William. He's dangerous. And if he's bringing more men—" "I won't be alone," William interrupted gently. "The sheriff's on our side, and the town is ready to help if it comes to that. But I need to make sure it doesn't come to them." Claire stared at him for a long moment, her emotions warring within her. She wanted to tell him to stay, to protect himself and their growing family. But she also knew the kind of man she had married, a man who would never back down when it came to protecting the people he loved. "Just promise me you'll come back," she whispered. William leaned across the table, taking her hands in his. "I promise." Late that night, William made his way into town to meet with Sheriff Daniels. The sheriff was waiting for him at the jailhouse, a small building that doubled as the town's meeting place. Inside, a few trusted men sat around a table, their faces grim as they discussed the situation. "Pete's not done," the sheriff said as William entered. "He's been seen gathering men in Copper Hollow, about 10 miles west of here. Word is he's promising them a big score if they help him take you down." William nodded, his expression unreadable. "How many?" "8 or 10, maybe more," the sheriff replied. "But they're not soldiers, they're drifters and thieves. Trouble? Sure, but nothing you can't handle." William glanced at the men seated around the table. He recognized a few of them: farmers, shopkeepers, men who had taken up arms to defend the town during tough times. They weren't trained fighters, but they were brave and determined. "I don't want the town caught in the middle of this," William said. "If Pete's coming, I'll deal with him before he gets here." One of the men, a burly farmer named Jack, spoke up. "You don't have to do this alone, William. We're willing to stand with you." William shook his head. "I appreciate that, but this fight started with me, and it'll end with me." The sheriff leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're sure about this?" "I am," William said, his voice steady. "Just keep the town safe." "If I don't come back—" "You will," the sheriff interrupted firmly. "And when you do, We'll make sure Pete and his crew are brought to justice." William nodded, appreciating the support even as he prepared to face what lay ahead. He left the jailhouse with a clear plan in mind. If Pete wanted a fight, he would get one, but on William's terms. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, William saddled his horse and rode out toward Copper Hollow. The air was cold and crisp, the silence broken only by the rhythmic sound of hooves on dirt. He carried only what he needed: a rifle, a pistol, and the determination to end this once and for all. When he reached the outskirts of Copper Hollow, he dismounted and approached on foot, moving silently through the trees. In the distance, he spotted a campfire, its flickering light revealing a group of men seated around it. Pete was among them, his injured hand wrapped tightly, his voice carrying as he gave orders. William crouched behind a tree, observing the scene. He counted 9 men, all armed and laughing loudly, their confidence apparent. Pete, however, looked different. His face was harder, his movements more erratic. He was a man driven by desperation. William exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on his rifle. This was it, the moment to put an end to the threat that had haunted his family. He took aim, his mind steady and his resolve unshakable. William steadied his breathing, his rifle aimed at the group of men around the fire. His mind was sharp, each detail etched into his memory. The number of men, their weapons, their positions. Pete sat in the center, gesturing wildly as he barked orders, his voice filled with anger and desperation. "This is it," Pete growled, his injured hand clenched into a fist. "We'll hit him at sundown. He thinks he's safe and hiding in that house of his, but this time we'll burn it to the ground." The men murmured in agreement, though their enthusiasm seemed forced. Pete's relentless obsession with William had started to wear on them. Some of the newer recruits glanced nervously at one another, doubt creeping into their expressions. William observed silently, his pulse steady as he calculated his next move. He had the element of surprise, and he intended to use it. This wasn't just about defending his home anymore. It was about ensuring that Pete never threatened anyone again. Moving with precision, William circled the camp, staying hidden in the shadows of the trees. He set his traps as he went, placing small explosive charges he had crafted back at the house, enough to create chaos but not to kill. This fight wasn't about vengeance. It was about sending a message. When he was ready, he positioned himself behind a large boulder that overlooked the camp. From here he could see everything, the firelight flickering on Pete's face, the way his men shifted uneasily, the weapons lying within arm's reach. He exhaled slowly and fired his first shot. The bullet struck a lantern hanging from a branch, shattering the glass and plunging the camp into partial darkness. The sudden noise sent the men into a frenzy, scrambling for cover and shouting in confusion. "What was that?" one of them yelled, his voice panicked. Pete stood, his pistol drawn, his eyes scanning the trees. "It's him!" he roared. "Stay together! Don't let him pick us off!" But Pete's command came too late. Another shot rang out, striking the ground near the fire and scattering sparks. The men dove for cover, their earlier bravado replaced by fear. William's voice cut through the chaos, calm and unyielding. "Pete, you've got one chance to end this. Walk away now, and I'll let you leave. Stay, and you'll regret it." Pete's face twisted in fury. "You think you can scare me?" he shouted, firing blindly into the trees. "Come out and fight like a man." William didn't respond. Instead, he triggered one of the traps, setting off a small explosion near the edge of the camp. The blast sent dirt and debris flying, throwing the bandits into further disarray. One of Pete's men, a younger recruit who had clearly never faced anything like this, dropped his weapon and bolted into the forest. "I'm not dying for this," he shouted over his shoulder. Pete snarled, firing another shot into the darkness. "Coward!" he screamed, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. From his vantage point, William watched as the group began to fracture. Fear was taking hold, and it was only a matter of time before the others followed the young man's lead. He fired another shot, this time striking a tree near Pete, sending splinters flying. "Pete," William called out, his voice steady, "this is your last chance. Take your men and go." Pete's grip on his pistol tightened, his knuckles white. "Never," he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. "You think you've won. You think you're better than me." William sighed, his resolve firm. He didn't want to kill anyone, but Pete wasn't leaving him much choice. He adjusted his aim, his sights trained on Pete's weapon. With a single, precise shot, he disarmed him, the pistol flying from his hand and landing in the dirt. Pete stumbled back, clutching his injured hand and cursing loudly. The remaining men froze, their eyes darting between Pete and the darkness surrounding them. They were trapped, outmaneuvered, and terrified. "That's enough," William said, stepping out from the shadows. His rifle held steady. The firelight illuminated his face, calm but resolute. "It's over." The bandits dropped their weapons, their will to fight completely drained. One by one they raised their hands in surrender, their eyes wide with fear. But Pete wasn't ready to give up. He lunged for his fallen pistol, his face twisted with rage. Before he could reach it, William fired a warning shot into the ground at his feet, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't," William warned, his voice like steel. "You've already lost." Pete sank to his knees, his shoulders slumping in defeat. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of the wind. "You're done," William said, his eyes locked on Pete. "Go back to wherever you came from, and don't ever come near my family or this town again." The men helped Pete to his feet, their expressions grim. Without a word, they began to retreat, disappearing into the trees. Pete glanced back once, his face a mix of hatred and fear, before following the others into the darkness. William watched them go, his rifle still at the ready. Only when the last of them had vanished did he lower his weapon, his body finally relaxing. The threat was gone, for now. As the sun began to rise, William mounted his horse and rode back toward town, the weight of the night's events heavy on his shoulders. He had won, but he knew the battle had left its mark, on him, on Claire, and on the quiet life they had worked so hard to build. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, William rode back toward his home. The morning light felt strange after the darkness of the night's battle. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp and focused was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the weight of what had transpired. His grip on the reins tightened as his thoughts drifted to Claire, waiting for him at the house. He had promised her he would come back, and he had kept that promise, but the fight wasn't without its cost. When William reached the edge of the property, he slowed his horse, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The traps he had set around the perimeter remained undisturbed, and the house stood quiet and still. He dismounted, his boots crunching softly against the dirt as he approached the porch. The door creaked open before he could reach it, and Claire stepped out, her face pale, but her eyes filled with relief. "William!" she called, rushing down the steps to meet him. He caught her in his arms, holding her tightly as she clung to him. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice low and reassuring. "It's over." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you sure? Are they gone?" William nodded, his jaw set. "They won't be coming back. I made sure of it." Claire's shoulders sagged as the tension drained from her body. She rested her head against his chest, her hands gripping his shirt as if she were afraid to let go. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I thought—" "I know," William said softly, his hand running through her hair. "But it's done. They won't hurt us anymore." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the past days hanging between them. Finally, Claire stepped back, her hands still resting on his arms. "You need to rest," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've done enough." William hesitated, glancing back toward the horizon as if expecting trouble to return. But Claire's steady gaze brought him back to the present. He nodded. "You're right." Inside, the house felt strangely peaceful. The barricades and makeshift defenses remained, but the oppressive fear that had lingered for days seemed to have lifted. Claire led William to the kitchen, where she had prepared a simple meal. He sat down heavily, the exhaustion finally catching up with him. As he ate, Claire sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. William set his fork down, meeting her gaze. "Now we move forward. We rebuild, we take back our peace." "And Pete," she pressed, her voice tinged with worry. William's expression darkened. "He's done. He knows what will happen if he comes back." Claire nodded slowly, though the unease in her eyes lingered. "I just want us to be safe, William. For the baby." "We will be," he said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to you or our child." Meanwhile, in the forest, Pete and his remaining men limped back to their camp. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was thick with tension. Pete's pride was in shambles, his injured hand throbbing as he collapsed onto a log. His men avoided his gaze, their confidence in him shattered. "You said we'd win," one of them muttered, his voice laced with anger. "You said he was just a blacksmith." Pete didn't respond, his jaw clenched tightly. He stared into the dying fire, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. But deep down, he knew the truth. William had beaten him, not just with strength but with strategy and resolve. There was no coming back from this. "Maybe it's time we cut our losses," Frank said, his voice calm but firm. "You've pushed us far enough, Pete. It's over." Pete glared at him, but the fight had left his eyes. For the first time, he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back against the log, his face etched with defeat. The others exchanged glances before slowly gathering their things, leaving Pete alone by the fire. As the men disappeared into the trees, Pete remained, his thoughts swirling. The fire flickered and died, leaving him in darkness. Back at the house, William and Claire prepared for a new beginning. Over the next few days, they worked together to restore their home, removing the barricades and traps and replacing the broken pieces of their quiet life. The townsfolk, inspired by William's courage, rallied to help, bringing supplies and offering their support. Sheriff Daniels visited often, checking in to ensure the couple was safe. He assured them that the town was watching for any signs of Pete or his crew, but William knew in his heart that the battle was truly over. Pete had been defeated, not just physically but mentally. He wouldn't dare return. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, William and Claire sat on the porch, the world bathed in hues of orange and gold. Claire rested her hand on her growing belly, her face serene for the first time in days. "We made it," she said softly, leaning against William's shoulder. He nodded, his arm wrapped around her. "We did." As the stars began to appear in the sky, William allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but it had also reminded him of what he was fighting for: a family, a future, and a life worth protecting. And as he sat there with Claire, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a warm blanket, he knew one thing for certain: no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The days turned into weeks, and life in the small Colorado town began to settle back into its usual rhythm. The memory of the bandits faded into the background, replaced by the hum of everyday life. For William and Claire, the events of those harrowing nights remained etched in their minds, but they chose to focus on the future they were building together. The townsfolk, inspired by William's bravery, treated him with a newfound respect. People who had once kept their distance now greeted him warmly in the streets, offering their gratitude and admiration. Though William appreciated their kindness, he preferred to keep to himself, quietly returning to his work at the blacksmith's forge. Claire, too, found solace in the calm that followed. Her days were filled with preparations for the baby, her heart lighter now that the shadow of danger had passed. With the help of neighbors, she turned the house back into a home, its once defensive exterior now welcoming and warm. One morning, as William worked in the forge, Sheriff Daniels paid him a visit. The sheriff dismounted his horse and approached, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "Morning, William," Daniels said, tipping his hat. "Sheriff," William replied, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What brings you out here?" Daniels leaned against the fence, his gaze steady. "Just wanted to check in. Word is Pete and his crew are long gone. Last anyone saw of them, they were heading west, looking worse for wear." William nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. "Good. Let's hope they stay gone." "They will," Daniels said confidently. "You made sure of that." The sheriff paused, then added, "You know, you've done more than just protect your family. You've shown this town what it means to stand up for what's right. That's not something people forget." William looked away, the compliment sitting heavy on his shoulders. "I didn't do it for the town," he said quietly. "I did it for Claire and the baby." Daniels smiled faintly. "And that's exactly why people look up to you." The sheriff tipped his hat once more before heading back to his horse. "Take care, William. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." As Daniels rode off, William returned to his work, the rhythmic sound of the hammer striking metal filling the air. It was a sound that reminded him of the life he had fought to protect, a simple, honest life. That evening, William and Claire sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in vibrant hues of orange and pink, the beauty of the moment a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured. Claire rested her hand on her belly, her gaze soft and thoughtful. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. William reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "I do," he said. "Pete won't come back. And if he does—" He paused, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We'll be ready." Claire smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I hope our child grows up to have your strength." William's eyes softened as he looked at her. "And your kindness," he replied. "Together they'll be unstoppable." The two of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of their journey giving way to a quiet peace. The stars began to appear, twinkling against the darkening sky, and for the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to dream of the future without fear. As the scene fades, the story transitions to a reflective close. The camera focuses on the soft glow of the house, its porch light a beacon of hope in the darkness. This story reminds us of the lengths we'll go to protect the ones we love. William's courage and resilience weren't born from vengeance. They were born from love and the instinct to protect his family. It's a powerful reminder of the strength we all carry within us when it comes to standing up for what matters most. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales like this one. What would you do to protect your family? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that stirs your heart and keeps you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care and cherish the moments with your loved ones. They're what make life truly worth fighting for.